A farewell poem to life. Welcome back, Mere Mortalites, to another edition of the Mere Mortals Book Reviews. You've got Juan here, co-host of the Mere Mortals podcast, as well as the Mere Mortals Book Reviews, a channel where we try to bring to you books that we are reading, the juicy content that is within, and perhaps whether you so choose to read them or not. We've got today Japanese Death Poems. I know, interesting title, by Yoel Hoffmann. Now, just as a bit of background, Japanese Death Poems by Yoel Hoffmann. It's a compelling anthology that explores the Japanese tradition of Jisei. I don't know exactly how you pronounce that, folks. Or death poems, basically. Written by Zen monks and haiku poets as their final farewell to life. Sounds pretty interesting. Now, this collection provides a deep dive into the cultural and historical significance of these poems, reflecting on the life and the death and the impermanence of existence through the lens of Zen Buddhism. Now, the book itself starts with the actual appearance of the book. It's thick. Looks like there'd be a lot. And when you actually start going through the actual book itself, the writing is generally pretty small. So for me, I go, hey, this is pretty awesome. I can probably read it through fairly quickly. But the way that it's actually broken down as well makes it an even easier read. And in fact, this is one of those books that is not I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to read it cover to cover. No, in fact, it is broken down into what I'd say is three main sections, but it's part 1, part 2, and part 3. Part 1 being the introduction, part 2 being death poems by Zen monks, part 3 being death poems by the haiku poets. Now, the first section of that introduction that this particular book offers is 70-odd pages around background to poems that you're about to read. Zen monks, from haiku poets, the origination of haiku and its all the formats, all in there. So the breakdown of that is the poetry of Japan, death and the poetry, and a cultural history in Japan, and then some notes around those poems. So it really gives you a bit of a guide. That would be the only section in this book that I'd say, yeah, you're going to have to read it sort of straight through to get a bit of a guidance. But then the other two parts, which is more so around directly those poems, becomes much easier to read in the sense of it's a pick up, read a couple of times, or, find a particular section, read a few, put it down. More along that nature as opposed to a cover to cover. So pick up and drop type of book as opposed to read it all the way through. So be mindful of that. As I talked about those two sections, you really do want to read that first section, it seems, around the Japanese death poems. It gives you a bit of an insight. When you get into the actual two sections where there's the meat and potatoes, I would say, which is the actual poems of the various people, the structure that Yoel Hoffmann's put this through is usually it's got a date, it's got a call out of the individual, whether it's a name or not a name, lists down the poem. There's also the equivalent Japanese translation of it. And sometimes there'll be a little bit of a summary around what that poem meant, what it intended, what it didn't intend. Sometimes it doesn't at all. Sometimes it's just straight up name, poem, that's it. That's what I'm going to leave it to. It was enjoyable. It was enjoyable to see some of the summary and some of the definitions. In fact, some of it absolutely helped. And in other formats, I went, I kind of wanted to know a little bit more. And then in other aspects, it was totally fine that it had no more. It was just a standalone, and it was, I guess, more for the reader to kind of observe and take it all in. The premise of the book, though, of Japanese death poems, really as a summary, is giving you a bit of an insight into what is these death poems that the Japanese sort of create, why from a cultural, historical perspective it has arisen. Now, coming from the West, I think for myself, lived in South America, moving to Australia, there wasn't a lot of conversation around what is death poems, what would you write them for. There's a lot of background here as to why from that culture, from a Japanese culture perspective, they would do so. From a reading and understanding of all of these death poems, I would only really recommend this particular book for someone who is ready to philosophize ideas presented from hundreds of years ago and finds that interesting or maybe refreshing, as opposed to trying to read this and find effective practical items to pull away and really put into a day-to-day life. And coming into it, I might have done the wrong thing with this book in terms of, I personally gave it a 7 out of 10, and reflecting back a couple of weeks after really reading the book, I went, you know what? I came into it with the wrong expectations. I perhaps came into it thinking Japanese death poems written by Zen monks in this haiku poet style. Yeah, I'm going to get really practical, applicable learnings throughout these little notes perhaps, or some long lust Zen ideas that I'm going to go, oh, they're so connected to what I do. And some of it I did, so don't get me wrong. You will probably find that throughout. And in fact, I've got a couple of tabs and notes here. Then you can go check out the actual full summary of my learning notes as well in a separate sort of session. But it wasn't throughout the entirety of the thing. And so at times I went, reflecting back, yeah, look, I came out with the wrong expectation. I shouldn't be reading this particular book as what effective philosophy can I take away and put it practically, as opposed to let me just sit with the ideas or the words or the thoughts of people who have written this down and put down the notes from the Japanese death poems. So from my perspective, is it a book that you should pick up as a must read? Look, I've actually recommended this book a couple of times to people. After reflecting on it again, I have to put a caveat. Pick up Japanese death poems if you feel like reading something quite somber, a little bit interesting, not a whole host of effective philosophy from my side, but to almost put you outside of your own body and see something through a different light, especially if you haven't immersed yourself into Japan or its history as well. At the time I was reading this, caveat, I was also attempting to learn a little bit of Japanese. I've since paused that, but there was a little bit of influence where I was sort of coinciding that with the enjoyment of learning Japanese. So take that for what it is. Perhaps it'll be lower in a few years' time. Will I be rereading this book? So again, kind of another quality of books. Would I reread them? Hardly. Hardly would I re-pick this up and look at it. However, there's a couple of noted items throughout here that I would reflect back on. However, I note them down in separate areas. So as you would see fit, I'd probably reflect to them as opposed to the book. Japanese death poems, just a little summary of the way that Zen monks and haiku poets themselves put the structure together. A lot of summary at the very beginning. But I think if you really enjoy this sort of stuff, maybe it's a tester for everything else. But beyond that, I'd say this might be one of those just laying it on the coffee table as a fun or interesting point of conversation. Because yes, as I said at the beginning, Japanese death poems, interesting choice of words. It has been touted by a few other people as being fantastic, Tim Ferriss being one. I wouldn't say it'd be absolutely amazing. So again, think about whether you actually go ahead and purchase this and what the reasons for that is. But that's all I have for now on this particular book. Have you read it before? Is this a book that you've picked up and you want to challenge me and say, hey, actually, no, it's way better than you're actually talking now because of X, Y, Z? Sure, tell me. I'd be keen. Maybe I'd go back and reflect on a couple of the titles and a couple of the items. But beyond that, that's just sort of my take. So if you have enjoyed this particular book review, if it influenced you to pick it up or for any other reason, make sure you let me know. Make sure you send through a boostergram. You can send through value back of the value that we are providing. Boostergram's an availability for you to on good podcasting apps and other areas to send us through a message with some satoshis attached, and we deeply appreciate that. Otherwise, leave some comments and notes wherever else that we might be able to see it. We can definitely contact you. For now, Immortal Lights, thank you very much. Take care wherever you are in the world. One out.